The Industrial and Financial Revolution refers to a long and complex transformation that reshaped economies, societies, and daily life from the late 18th century through the 19th century and into the modern age. It was not a single event but a sequence of related changes in production, finance, transport, energy, and social organization. Together, these changes moved much of the world from traditional agrarian systems to industrial and urban systems supported by modern finance. Understanding this revolution helps explain the rise of factories, the growth of cities, the spread of capitalism, the power of nation-states, and the foundations of the modern global economy. Before industrialization, most people lived in rural areas and worked in agriculture or small crafts. Production was local and slow, and goods were made in homes or small workshops by skilled workers. Energy came mainly from human or animal muscle, wind and water. Money existed, but banking and investment were limited, and many transactions depended on trust, personal networks, or barter. Markets were often local and transportation was slow and costly. As a result, economic growth was gradual and living standards changed little from one generation to the next. Several conditions prepared the way for industrial change. Population growth increased the demand for food, clothing, and basic goods. Scientific knowledge expanded during the 17th and early 18th centuries, leading to practical inventions and new ways of thinking about nature and resources. Agricultural improvements increased food supplies and reduced the risk of famine, which freed some workers to leave the countryside and seek work in towns. Trade networks expanded across oceans, bringing raw materials from distant regions and creating large markets for finished goods. Governments began to support commerce through laws that protected property, contracts, and patents, which encouraged people to invest and take risks. The first great center of industrialization was Britain. It possessed rich coal deposits, navigable rivers, active ports, and a growing empire that supplied raw materials and bought finished products. Britain also had a stable political system that supported entrepreneurs. One of the earliest industrial changes occurred in the textile industry. New machines such as the spinning jenny, the water frame, and the power loom greatly increased the speed and amount of cloth production. What once required many workers using hand tools could now be done by fewer workers using machines. This shift concentrated production in factories where machines could be housed and powered by water wheels and later by steam engines. The development of the steam engine was a turning point. Early steam engines were used to pump water out of mines, but later designs produced rotary motion which could operate machinery in factories. Steam power freed production from rivers and allowed factories to be built in cities near workers and markets. Coal became the main fuel and mining expanded to meet demand. Iron production also increased as new techniques made it cheaper and stronger. Railways and steamships soon followed, enabling goods and people to move faster and farther than ever before. Transportation costs fell and regional markets merged into national and international systems. Industrialization changed the nature of work. Factory labor was different from farm or craft labor. Workers followed strict schedules and performed repetitive tasks. Skills were often broken into simple actions so that people could be trained quickly. This de-skilling increased output but also reduced worker independence. Working conditions were often harsh. Factories were crowded, dangerous, and noisy. Wages were low and both women and children worked long hours. Urban housing was poor and sanitation was limited, leading to disease and high mortality in rapidly growing cities. At the same time, industrialization increased total production and wealth. Goods became cheaper and more widely available. New jobs appeared in manufacturing, transport, trade, and services. Over time, some workers gained higher wages and standards of living began to improve, especially in the later 19th century. A growing middle class emerged, consisting of managers, engineers, merchants, and professionals. Education expanded to supply skilled workers and literacy rates increased. Social mobility became more possible, although inequality remained significant. The financial revolution developed alongside industrial change and made large-scale investment possible. As factories, railways, and mines required huge sums of money, traditional methods of finance were insufficient. New institutions and instruments arose to mobilize savings and direct them into productive uses. Banks expanded their operations from simple deposit and lending functions to more complex services such as issuing notes, managing accounts, and financing large projects. Joint stock companies allowed many investors to pool resources and share risk. Stock markets provided places to buy and sell ownership shares, which made investment more liquid and attractive. Central banking also became more important. National banks regulated currency and supported financial stability. Government bonds created ways for states to borrow money from the public to fund wars, infrastructure, and administration. Insurance companies emerged to reduce risk for businesses and individuals by spreading losses across many participants. Accounting practices improved so that firms could track costs, profits, and investments more accurately. Together, these developments increased trust in financial systems and encouraged people to save and invest. Credit became a key engine of growth. Entrepreneurs could borrow to build factories, buy machines, and expand operations. Consumers could purchase goods on credit, which increased demand. Farmers could invest in tools and land improvements, which raised productivity. However, reliance on credit also created vulnerability. Overinvestment, speculation, and financial panic sometimes led to crashes and depressions. The 19th century witnessed several major financial crises that caused bankruptcies, unemployment, and social unrest. These events highlighted the need for regulation and oversight. The Industrial and Financial Revolution spread from Britain to continental Europe, the United States, and eventually to other parts of the world. Countries followed different paths depending on resources, politics, and culture. Germany and the United States emphasized heavy industries such as steel and chemicals, while France developed a mix of manufacturing and luxury goods. Japan in the late 19th century undertook rapid industrialization through state support and education reforms. Colonies and semi-independent regions supplied raw materials and served as markets, which integrated them into a global economic system, often on unequal terms. Global trade expanded enormously. Industrial nations exported manufactured goods and imported food and raw materials such as cotton, rubber, and minerals. Railways, ports, and canals were built to facilitate extraction and transport. This integration increased wealth in industrial centers but also created dependency in exporting regions. Local economies were reshaped to serve distant markets, and traditional industries often declined, which produced social dislocation. The unequal exchange of value and power contributed to imperial expansion and conflict. Urbanization was a major social effect of industrialization. Cities grew at extraordinary rates as people migrated in search of work. New neighborhoods, factories, and transport systems transformed landscapes. Urban life offered opportunities for cultural exchange, education, and political organization, but also brought problems such as overcrowding, pollution, and crime. Governments gradually responded with public health measures, housing reforms, and infrastructure projects including sewage systems, water supply, and public transit. The family and social relations also changed. In agricultural society, economic production and family life were closely linked. Industrialization separated work from home as people went to factories and offices. Women roles shifted as many entered wage labor while others were encouraged to focus on domestic responsibilities in middle-class households. Child labor became common in early factories but was later restricted by laws as moral concerns grew and schooling expanded. The idea of childhood as a protected stage of life gained acceptance. Political consequences followed economic changes. Industrial workers organized into trade unions to demand better wages, hours, and conditions. Strikes and protests occurred and sometimes resulted in conflict with employers and the state. Over time, labor movements gained legal recognition and influenced legislation. Political parties formed around economic interests and ideologies such as liberalism, socialism, and conservatism. Demands for broader voting rights increased and many countries expanded suffrage during the 19th century. Governments played growing roles in managing industrial society. They built infrastructure such as roads, railways, and ports. They regulated working conditions and child labor. They established public education systems and promoted scientific research. Fiscal and monetary policy became tools to guide economic activity. The modern administrative state emerged as a result of these responsibilities. Culturally, the Industrial and Financial Revolution changed how people viewed time, work, and progress. Clocks and schedules organized daily life. Efficiency, productivity, and innovation became valued ideals. Many believed that science and technology would lead to endless improvement. At the same time, critics worried about alienation, environmental damage, and moral decline. Writers, artists, and philosophers responded with works that celebrated or condemned industrial society. The tension between optimism and anxiety remains part of modern culture. Technological change continued beyond the early industrial period. Electricity replaced steam as a primary power source. New industries such as chemicals, automobiles, and communications developed. The telegraph, telephone, and later radio and cinema transformed information and entertainment. Mass production techniques such as the assembly line increased output and reduced costs. Consumer culture expanded as advertising and branding created demand for new products. Financial systems also evolved. International capital flows increased as investors sought opportunities abroad. Currencies were linked through gold-based systems which facilitated trade but also transmitted shocks. In the 20th century, central banks gained more tools to influence economies through interest rates and money supply. Financial markets became complex networks involving stocks, bonds, derivatives, and other instruments. While these systems supported growth, they also introduced new forms of risk as seen in later crises. Environmental impact is another important legacy. Industrialization depended on fossil fuels which released pollution into air and water. Deforestation, mining, and urban expansion altered landscapes. Wildlife habitats were destroyed and some species declined. In recent times, awareness of environmental limits has grown. Efforts to develop renewable energy and sustainable practices can be seen as responses to problems created during the industrial era. The Industrial and Financial Revolution also influenced patterns of inequality. Wealth accumulated among industrialists, financiers, and property owners while many workers lived with insecurity. Over time, welfare systems such as pensions, unemployment insurance, and public health programs were created to reduce hardship. Education and labor laws helped improve opportunities. Yet inequality remains a challenge as technology and globalization continue to shape economies unevenly. Education itself transformed. Industrial society required literate, numerate, and disciplined workers. Schools adopted standardized curricula and schedules. Universities expanded research and technical training. Knowledge became specialized and professional careers developed. The connection between education and economic success strengthened, which encouraged families to invest in schooling. Another major effect was globalization. Transportation and communication networks linked distant regions into shared systems of production and exchange. Cultural influences spread along with goods and capital. Languages, fashions, and ideas traveled faster than ever. This created hybrid cultures and new identities, but also tensions between local traditions and global influences. The role of women in society was deeply affected. While early industrial work exploited female labor, it also introduced new opportunities for independence and activism. Women organized unions, participated in reform movements, and demanded political rights. The struggle for suffrage and equality gained momentum in industrial societies where education and communication allowed ideas to circulate widely. Health and life expectancy changed significantly. Improvements in food supply, sanitation, and medicine gradually reduced mortality. Urban epidemics were controlled through public health measures. Industrial societies invested in hospitals and medical research. As a result, populations grew older and larger, which created new social needs and economic challenges. It is important to recognize that the Industrial and Financial Revolution was not universally positive or negative. It produced wealth, innovation, and cultural dynamism, but also suffering, inequality, and environmental harm. Different groups experienced its effects in different ways. Workers, entrepreneurs, consumers, and colonized peoples all had distinct perspectives. A full understanding requires attention to these varied experiences. In the present day, the legacy of this revolution remains evident. Factories supply goods across continents. Financial markets operate around the clock. Cities continue to grow. Work is increasingly shaped by machines and digital systems, which represent a new phase of industrial change. Debates about automation, artificial intelligence, and economic inequality reflect concerns similar to those raised by early industrialization. The story of the Industrial and Financial Revolution teaches that economic systems are created by human choices and institutions. Technology alone does not determine outcomes. Laws, cultural values, and political power shape how tools are used and who benefits. This insight suggests that future development can be guided toward more inclusive and sustainable goals if societies choose to do so. In conclusion, the Industrial and Financial Revolution transformed the world more profoundly than perhaps any other process in modern history. It changed how people work, live, travel, communicate, and think. It created the foundations of contemporary economies and societies while introducing challenges that continue to demand solutions. Studying this transformation provides perspective on present conditions and reminds us that change is constant and that the choices made during periods of transition have lasting consequences.